My name is Simon Johnson. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great honor always to follow Joe Stiglitz. And I would like to take my 8 minutes and talk about the broader economic context, the macroeconomic implications of exactly the problems that Joe has just outlined for you briefly. The standard narrative for our current situation goes like this, that we've had a series of unfortunate accidents. Somehow the world has a major financial crisis or disruption every 3 or 5 or so years. That's what Hank Paulson says in his book. That's what Larry Summers says at times. And that's what Jamie Dimon says. Must be true. And the picture that captures it is this picture, which shows you the growth in private sector credit to GDP, obviously understating what's happened to our credit system. Because it doesn't capture off-balance sheet transactions, it doesn't capture the full nature of securitization, but it shows you that we've become more credit dependent, finance has increased in its importance in our economy. And we've had these repeated crises to which we respond with an easing of policy. We used to refer to this somewhat humorously as the Greenspan put. I don't think it's funny anymore, and it's not about Mr. Greenspan anymore. And you see we've reached this rather awkward point, according to the standard narrative, where there's actually nowhere to go in terms of cutting the federal funds rate next time. But is it a series of accidents and a downward trajectory, downward gradual drift somewhere, rather uncertain and unpleasant perhaps, or is it a loop? Are we going round and round? In the sense that, and I put up some pictures of people who may be familiar to you. I won't go through their names, but this is a specific manifestation of what Joe just said, which is it's a system of incentives. There are incentives to take a lot of risk. If I run a big firm, financial firm, and we have a good year, I'm going to do well, my shareholders will do well. Private benefits, as Joe said. If it goes badly, it's not that much of my problem. 1 or 2 people may lose their jobs, it's true, but most of the losses hit society in terms of bailouts, in terms of unemployment, in terms of that fiscal response. What is the fiscal cost of this crisis? Well, according to the Congressional Budget Office, and I'm on their panel of economic advisors, this is my view, I'm not representing the CBO here, but my view, reading their numbers, is the increase in net government debt held by the private sector as a result of the 2008-2009 crisis will be 40% of GDP. 40. Okay? That's an externality. And that's not it. It's 8 million jobs. That's an externality. And it's a loop. So you get the bailouts, you tweak the regulations, and I think that's the phase we're in right now, and you come out with the same sort of incentives as before. You're going to go around and around until it breaks. Now, this is not an accident. This is not didn't drop randomly from the skies upon us. This is the result of the Reagan Revolution applied to finance. Now, we can discuss at great length whether some parts of the Reagan Revolution made sense and whether some forms of deregulation were helpful to this economy and around the world. But the financial part of what happened was huge and, I'm afraid, in the end, has devastating effects. This is a picture of data collected and put together by Thomas Philippon and Ariel Reshev, which shows on the right side, as you look at it, what happened to financial regulation in the United States. And here you see President Roosevelt, FDR, came in and led a massive regulation, re-regulation, you could say, or regulation, in the 1930s, which lasted for about 50 years. And then, of course, we had a wave of deregulation. What happened to wages in the financial sector? Well, not surprisingly, perhaps, wages were very high in the financial sector. This is average wages. This doesn't capture inequality within the financial sector. It doesn't capture how great it is to be one of the big winners. Wages were high prior to the Great Depression. The same kind of behavior we've seen today was rewarded then. Relative wages in the financial sector were low in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Okay? Banking was relatively boring in this sense and in other senses. And relative compensation in the financial sector has gone up a lot as the financial sector became deregulated. Now, why should I bring this up? Why would you care? Am I just expressing envy? Well, perhaps. But I would say among other things, I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at MIT. I think I agree completely with Joe that we need a vibrant financial sector. This country is based on free and fair markets for finance. That is not what we have today. That is not what we built since the 1980s. This is profits, real corporate profits, in the financial sector and the non-financial sector. And if you haven't seen this picture before, spend some time with it. We can talk about it afterwards. This is in a book that we have coming out in a few weeks called 13 Bankers. I'll also tell you who the 13 bankers are, if you're nice to me. Look at what happened since the 1980s. Look at what happened to financial sector profits. This is not free, fair, competitive markets. This is actually Elizabeth Warren, who'll join us in a moment, meets Joe Stiglitz. This is massive, rampant abuse of consumers. This is an industry where they talk about ripping the face off customers, okay, with great success, and a legal basis for doing that. Every attempt to rein them in has been defeated. This is an intermediate input. This is supposed to make the rest of the economy work better. These numbers tell you that hasn't gone well in the past 20 years. And look, if you can, at the end. Q4 of 2008, financial sector profits fall back close to what was the profits in the non-financial sector. But look at the very last data we have there. Look at what happens in 2009. Look at the rebound in finance. This is not over. The biggest banks in this country, the big six, is what I would focus on, had assets worth less than 20% of GDP in the early 1990s. The same six banks and their successors, obviously there's been a big wave of mergers. That's part of the mechanism through which this has happened, as well as the bailouts. Those big six banks have assets to GDP over 60%. It is getting bigger. It got bigger, of course, as a result of the way they were saved and of the policies of this administration, as well as the previous administration. They have a huge funding advantage. They hold all the cards in the over-the-counter derivatives market, for example. They are making enormous profits. They are buying assets from other banks around the world. JP Morgan Chase just bought a big commodities operation from Royal Bank of Scotland. Of course they'll get bigger. There is no limit in sight to this. They are too big to fail. They are becoming bigger. The idea you can solve it with the resolution authority, we'll talk about that later, I think is rather illusory. The big banks have to be reined in. If they're not reined in, if they're not broken, politically, very important point Rob Johnson's been making for a long time, it's about the campaign contributions, as well as about their intellectual power and their ability to convince people like you that we need them in something like this current form. If we don't change that, if we don't move that consensus, we have big trouble ahead. Thank you very much.